All right, guys. Last topic we're going to talk about is the relationship between science and religion. So this is a big topic in philosophy in general, and I think it's important for you guys since we spent all semester talking about religion, but you guys are also studying critical thinking, which is kind of more scientific thinking. So I want to talk about the relationship between religion and science. Okay. So some of the stuff in the beginning, I'm going to go through kind of quickly because it's stuff that you probably talked about in critical thinking class. So first off, I just want to talk about what the definition of science is. So the word science in English just comes from the Latin word scienter, which just means knowledge. So science just means knowledge. Traditionally, all forms of study were called science. So it didn't matter what it was. If you were studying philosophy, then you were still a scientist. You were just studying philosophical science. In other words, everything used to be science. If you were studying biology, then you were a natural scientist. But kind of the modern term obviously is a little bit different. So now we only use the word science for the study of the natural world. But in general, it really just means the pursuit of knowledge. That's it. In the ancient world, especially among the Greeks, science, or the pursuit of knowledge, was in some ways similar to what we do today, in other ways different. So we talked about Aristotle already. So we know Aristotle is considered kind of the father or maybe grandfather of science. We know Aristotle focused on gathering data with the five senses, so empiricism. So in general, you can think of Aristotle as kind of the father of scientific thinking. Whereas Plato is, although he believes in the power of reason, in a way he's, some people consider him the father of art or the father of religion because of his belief that we can't only rely on our five senses. And so the idea is that Plato represents kind of a more creative way of thinking. Now, even though Aristotle focused on gathering data, like I said, remember he had some ideas that later scientists are going to reject. So we know that Aristotle believed in this idea of teleology, which we talked about. Teleology is the idea that everything that exists has a purpose. In the scientific revolution about 500 years ago, scientists essentially kind of rejected that idea. They stopped thinking about purpose, and they just really focused on how things work. So that emphasis on how things work, we usually call mechanistic philosophy. Like I think of a mechanism, like how something works. So think of Aristotle as interested in purpose, whereas modern scientists are interested in like mechanics, how things work. Now that focus on purpose is something that Christian thinkers adopted from Aristotle. So Christian thinkers were, in Europe, were trying to find a way for Christian ideas to seem more philosophical. So Christianity, we know, is 2,000 years old. But Europe already had a body of philosophy before that. So remember, all the Greek stuff, all the Roman stuff, that comes before Christianity. So Christianity is entering a world that already has philosophy. It's already there, right? And so what Christian thinkers try to do is they try to show that Christianity fits with Greek philosophy. Now with Plato, it was pretty easy, because Plato said, hey, this world is not really real, and there's another ultimately real world. So what Plato called the world of forms. Well, the world of forms, it sounds a lot like the Christian idea of heaven. Christians think of this world as kind of temporary, not really that important. So that fits with Plato. So Christian thinkers were able to use some of Plato's ideas, right? But the problem with Aristotle was that he was more scientific. So what Christian thinkers did is they grabbed this idea of teleology. And Aristotle said everything exists has a purpose. Well, for Christians, this made sense. Because if God designed the world, if the world is planned, right, then it makes sense that everything in this world has a purpose. So essentially, Christian thinkers, they grabbed Platonic idealism, right, Platonic idealism, and they grabbed Aristotelian teleology, right, and they put those things together, and that really forms, like, you could call it Christian philosophy, right? So they tried to combine parts of Plato and Aristotle. And it was common among Christians to even argue that Plato and Aristotle were preparing the world for Christianity. This was a common argument to make, right? You know, before God sent a savior, right? You know, he was trying to prepare the world for Christianity. And so this is how Christian thinkers tried to make their ideas fit with the big philosophers that already existed. You know, people had such respect for Plato and Aristotle that Christian thinkers did not want them to think of Christianity as something totally new. They did not want them to think of Christianity as going against the Greeks, because the Greeks had so much respect, right? So they had to figure out a way to make it fit, and that was the best way to do it. And you can still see Aristotelian teleology in Christian ideas today. So for example, I think it's a little bit extreme, but I was watching a YouTube video, and it was a Christian minister, like a Christian preacher, and he was talking about how God designed everything in the world that exists. And he picks up a banana, or like an actual banana, and he's like holding it, and he's like, look, see how the curve of the banana, it fits the human hand like perfectly, right? It's like a handle. God designed the banana. It's a handle. And then he's holding it, and he said, look, and he like peels the banana, you know, and he says, like, look, it's like so easy to eat. It's just like, you know, it has packaging, you know, packaging by God, you know, and you just like peel it, and then you can eat it. This way of thinking is a Christian way of thinking, but it comes from Aristotle. That, like, if something exists, there must be a reason why it's like that. Why is a banana curved? Why is it curved? Well, God wanted to make it easy to hold on to, right? So this is Aristotelian, but it's also kind of Christian way to think. Now, scientists, modern scientists, of course, are going to reject teleology and reject idealism. So modern scientists are going to grab Aristotle's empiricism, right? They're going to grab his emphasis on the five senses, right? But they're going to reject Aristotle's teleology, this idea of purpose, right? And they're going to reject Plato's idealism. Okay, so they're going to reject the idea that this world is not real, right? And essentially, we're going to get the foundation of modern science. So the foundation of modern science is empiricism and mechanism, right? So mechanistic philosophy, where the focus is on figuring out how things work, forgetting about the why, you know. So for, you know, especially since Darwin, scientists do understand that, you know, there's a reason why the banana is shaped the way it's shaped. But they would focus on natural evolutionary reasons why it has that shape. So obviously modern scientists, they do not believe the world was designed ahead of time, right? So they believe the world evolved according to natural processes. So in a way, there is a reason why the world is the way it is. There is a reason, but there's no purpose built into it. So scientists don't think the world is random. They think there are natural explanations for why the world is the way it is. But that's not the same as saying it's designed. So for scientists, the world is explainable, but not designed. So it has no purpose. It has no general purpose. Another thing about ancient science that was changed or rejected in modern science is the emphasis on experimentation. We know that modern science is based on experiments. right? Well, the interesting thing is Aristotle discussed experimentation. And for Aristotle, he looked at experiments as artificial or not real. In other words, if like human beings set up some kind of experiment, well, for Aristotle, he said, well, then it's not real. It's like fake. It's like human beings did it, you know? And so in the ancient world, we don't see experiments like we see in modern science. So in the scientific revolution, they realized that because natural forces are at work, we can design experiments to study natural forces. So obviously when we set up an experiment, we are of course creating something artificial, but we can use an artificial experiment to understand natural forces. So that's another characteristic of modern science, which is different from ancient science. Now, I'm not going to talk much about the scientific revolution because you should have kind of learned it already. But, you know, essentially the scientific revolution is just scientists getting skeptical about tradition. So, you know, it's roughly 500 years ago, something like that, where scientists just start doubting everything. You know, it's like there were a lot of ancient beliefs, like the belief that the world was flat, ancient belief, or the belief that the Earth was the center of the solar system. It's a very common belief. Christians believe that the Earth was the center of everything in the universe, right? And you can imagine, if the Earth was the center of the universe, if we really were, so if all the planets and the sun and all the stars, if they spun around the Earth, you can imagine it's pretty easy to believe that we were created by God. You know, if the entire universe rotated around us, you can see how like it'd be much easier to believe in God if we're the center of everything, right? But scientists, you know, once they started looking up at the stars and once they started taking measurements, once they started being systematic, like we talked about in critical thinking, once they looked at the data, they started to realize that the objects in the sky, they don't move around Earth, right? And it took a couple hundred years to figure it out, you know, but guys like Copernicus and Galileo and other thinkers, they figured out, wait a minute, we're not the center. The only thing that spins around us is the moon. You know, that's it. We're spinning around the sun, and then on top of that, our solar system is spinning around a galaxy. So, unfortunately, the scientists found out that we're not the center of anything, right? And this started somewhat of a conflict between science and religion that has continued today. Because sometimes scientists just discover something, and it just contradicts what religion says. It just goes against what religion says. Like the Pope taught that the Earth was the center of the universe. But scientists looked at the data and they said that's not true, right? And so that's kind of the last topic we're going to talk about, is this relationship. Is science and religion really in conflict? Can they fit together? And, you know, and all the arguments about this issue. On page 2, there is a summary of the scientific method. So on page 2, a summary of the scientific method. You should know it already, but basically the scientific method involves making observations, gathering data, right? Using the data to come up with a theory. So that process in critical thinking class we call induction. Induction is making a general theory from specific things. Induction, right? And then you want to develop a way to test your theory by coming up with some kind of specific experiment. So that process is deduction, so observation, induction, deduction. And then, of course, you conduct the experiment and you gather more data, decide if your theory has been confirmed or rejected, And then, of course, you just go back to the beginning and make a new theory, come up with a new experiment, and you just keep going. So think of it as a process. Scientists will never stop experimenting. They'll just keep doing more experiments, changing the experiment, until they figure out how the world works. So observation, induction, deduction, experiments, and then when you do the experiment, you observe the results, and you're back at the beginning again. Right? Observation, induction, deduction, experiment. Observation, induction, deduction, experiment. And it just keeps going, right? It just keeps going, and you get better theories, you get a better hypothesis, and you keep making it more detailed, and you learn more about the way the world actually works. So remember, again, from critical thinking class, for scientists, no knowledge is permanent. Knowledge is just temporary based on the best information we have right now. So 30 years ago, they had some ideas about cancer, and they had a way to treat cancer 30 years ago. Based on the best knowledge they had 30 years ago, doctors treated cancer in a certain way. Okay? Now, it turns out their cancer treatment didn't work very much, so most people died of cancer 30 years ago. Okay? But that was the best that scientists knew at the time. But every year, new experiments, new studies, new data, and they start realizing, wait, we were wrong about that. It doesn't work that way. It works this way. And they come up with a new treatment. So 20 years ago, they start treating cancer in a different way. And it's a little bit more successful. Right? But 10 years ago, they realized, oh my God, we were totally wrong about that. We should do it this way. So scientists are always proving themselves wrong. That's what they do. That's what they do for a living. Right? They prove themselves wrong. Right? So at any given time, you use the best knowledge you have at that time. But in 10 years, there'll be better knowledge. You know? So there's stuff that doctors are doing today that in 10 years, they will realize it was a mistake, we shouldn't have done that. You understand? And then 10 years after that, they'll learn some more. You know? So for scientists, there's no permanent state of knowledge. Like, knowledge is always temporary. And as long as you stick to the scientific method, like, knowledge will improve, right? And you won't go backwards, you won't lose stuff. But just like we look back at some things, you know, like doctors used to do crazy stuff to patients. For example, doctors figured out, they knew that blood could carry disease. So they figured that out. So they figured out that sometimes if someone was sick, if you came in contact with their blood, then you could get sick. So they figured that out. So they knew there was disease in the blood. So for 1,000 years, a common treatment for disease was to drain blood out of people. So when people were sick, they would cut open a vein and they put a tube in there and they would just drain blood out of people when they were sick. For 1,000 years. Okay, to get the disease out. Okay? What we call it in English, called bloodletting, to let the blood out. Bloodletting. It was wrong. Okay, bloodletting killed a lot of people. Okay, it killed a lot of people. But it was the best knowledge they had at the time. Like, they had partial understanding. They were right. Disease is in the blood. They were right about that. But unfortunately, draining the blood out, it doesn't get the disease out. It just makes people weaker. Right? So they were wrong. But they figured out they were wrong. Right? So this is just the way science works. Like, science works by making mistakes. Right? And then you get real information from making those mistakes. And then you update your knowledge. You update your knowledge. I think I talked about in critical thinking class, I personally actually am a cancer survivor. So I'm a cancer survivor. But it was a little bit weird when I was reading about the cancer that I had. I knew that when I did the research, I knew that my cancer had a high survival rate. So I was like, happy about that, right? But I started reading, and just in 1985, the cancer that I had a 90% fatality rate. In 1985. 90% fatality rate. You know, so it's just the state of knowledge at that time. which is not where it is. You know, science is getting better every year, every 5 years, every 10 years. It's getting better, and that's why I'm alive. You know, because they figured some stuff out between 1985 and 2005. They figured stuff out, right? And I'm alive. You know, and just that's the way science works. You know, it can't be right about anything, or can't be right about everything. It works by making mistakes. You know, if that makes any sense, because you try the best thing you have at the time, and then you look at what happens from that, right? And then you realize, okay, that's not right. Let's try something else. And then in the long run, we just get a better understanding about nature, right? And life gets better, you know, in the long run. Now, religion, not all religions are the same, but religions tend to focus on knowledge that is absolute. So in general, religious knowledge is not thought of as temporary in general. It's not thought of as things that change. So for example, the Ten Commandments. You know, the Ten Commandments are God's law on earth. You know, stealing is wrong, adultery is wrong, murder is wrong. Those are not considered temporary ideas. Like, you can't change that. You know, if you believe in the Vedas, if you believe the Vedas is the Word of God, well then that's it. Like, the Vedas are kind of frozen in time. If you believe the Quran is the Word of God, well, it's frozen in time. Like, the Quran, we know what it is. The Quran is not going to change, right? So, not every religion is the same, of course, but in general, in religion, the idea of permanent truth is more common, right? In science, all truths are temporary. You know, all truths are based on what we know now. But we know knowledge can improve. So scientists change their opinion of stuff. But in general, in religion, the view is that things are permanent. Knowledge is permanent. Okay, so let's talk about this issue of possible conflict. So first off, let's state some facts about it. One fact is that most scientists throughout history, especially in the past, were religious people. Not necessarily all of them, but a lot of the famous scientists of the scientific revolution, like Isaac Newton and Galileo, these guys were all Christians. So for them, there was no conflict, you know, in their mind. You know, they were scientists making great discoveries, but they also believed in God and believed in Christ, and they were religious. And that's still true today. So even many of today's great scientists are personally religious people. Okay? So that's just a fact. So when we talk about conflict, we're not really talking about conflict inside one person. The way the human mind works, it's capable of balancing both things. It's true that today a lot of scientists are atheists, okay? But definitely not all of them. You know, I don't know, maybe 30–40% of scientists are atheists, which is more than the general population. But probably still the majority of scientists today are religious people. So when we talk about conflict, we're not talking about a conflict like in human psychology. Like, in terms of human psychology, people have no problem, you know, being totally rational and evidence-based when they do work or when they learn about medicine or physics, but then they have no problem going to a temple or a church on the weekend, which might be more based on faith. So inside the human brain, there's not a conflict. Okay? It's possible to balance these things. Okay? So if there is a conflict, it has to be like a purely philosophical one, not a psychological conflict, you know. So the question is, do the ideas of science contradict the ideas of religion? That's what we mean by conflict. And we're not talking about individual people. Okay. Another fact is that historically, there definitely has been some actual conflict, just historically. So for example, when Galileo published his book proving that the Earth was not the center of the universe, the Catholic Church had him arrested, and eventually they forced him to publicly say that his book was wrong. So basically, they threatened him with execution. And so he publicly had to say, yeah, all my data's wrong, right? So he had to kind of withdraw his claim, you know. But of course, the data was good, the data was real, and Galileo was right. And so throughout history, there has been actual conflict between science and the church, you know. So the church has arrested people, the church has put people to death, because, like I said, many religions punish blasphemy. So we talk about blasphemy. Blasphemy is going against the beliefs of the church, you know, and you can be punished for that. And so traditionally, scientists did publish stuff that went against beliefs of the church, and many of them were, in fact, punished. However, the church is not always kind of anti-science. For example, the modern Catholic Church, the current Catholic Church, they have a scientific branch of the church, and they fund a lot of proper, true science research. So the modern church tries to present itself as very pro-science. So today the church doesn't arrest scientists or anything like that, and they actually fund a lot of scientific research. And as some of you guys know, the Catholic Church in general is a huge promoter of education. So that's why you have Catholic schools all over the world, and that's why some of you guys graduated from Catholic schools. So Catholic grade schools, Catholic high schools, Catholic universities are all over the world. And so, so the church, I would say, does have a history of maybe being anti-science. That's really not true today. It's not really true today. So those are kind of like the facts of, you know, this kind of issue. Okay. And so what I want to do is get away from this question and just focus on the philosophical issues. So historically, there has been conflict, but let's focus on the ideas. Okay, that's what I want to focus on. So the idea that science and religion are in conflict, in general, is known as the conflict thesis. The conflict thesis. Okay. So what I want to do is I want to talk about the conflict thesis, and I'm going to explain what the thesis is and give some basic arguments in favor of it. Then I'm going to give some responses to the conflict thesis, right? And then I'll give some responses to that. So basically, this is just the debate. I want to teach you guys kind of the whole debate about the conflict between science and religion. So the basic argument that there is a conflict is that science is based on evidence and religion is based on faith. Faith means believing something without evidence. And you guys know from critical thinking class, that's the opposite of critical thinking, right? The golden rule of critical thinking is evidence before belief. That is the golden rule. For religion, you know, not all religions are exactly the same. Depends on what you're talking about. But especially a religion like Christianity is based on faith. It's almost like a test, you know. It's like a test of faith. Can you believe in the absence of evidence? Remember, we do not have a lot of evidence about the life of Jesus Christ. We don't have a lot of good evidence. Okay? We do not have one historical document that mentions Jesus' name that was written when Jesus was alive. Not one. And, you know, obviously most people could not read and write back then, but there was a written language. Hebrew, Aramaic, Latin, Greek, they had written languages. Remember, you know, written writing was 3,000 years ago. So 2,000 years ago during the life of Christ, like, there were educated people who could read and write. Okay? So we don't have anything written at the time that mentions it. Now, if you compare that to Socrates, okay, we have many books written while Socrates was alive that talk about him as a man. Now, we don't have anything that Socrates wrote himself, but we do have books written when Socrates was alive that talks about him specifically. And that was 400 years before Jesus. Okay? But in general, in Christianity, this issue of historical evidence is not relevant. It doesn't matter. Because you're supposed to believe without evidence. That's like real faith, is when you believe without evidence. You know, kind of the religious idea is, well, of course, anybody can believe if there is evidence. That's not special. It's not special to believe if there is evidence, right? What's special is if you believe in the absence of evidence. So if you define religion that way, then there obviously has to be a conflict. In other words, scientific thinking then is different from religious thinking. Like, you can't make those two ideas fit together. You can't make evidence and faith fit together. It's like, how can it fit together? You know, one says evidence before belief, and the other one says belief before evidence. So that's the conflict thesis. You know, the conflict thesis is that these things just can't fit together. Now, in favor of the conflict thesis, people will point to this as a matter of history. Okay? Historically, when people did not understand something about the world, I like to use lightning as an example. So obviously in the past, people didn't understand electricity. People did not know what lightning was. And so people had supernatural explanations. The Greeks thought Zeus was angry, and Zeus was throwing thunderbolts down on Earth. That was the best explanation people had. They didn't understand science. So they thought it was the gods. Okay? However, over time, as we understand the world more, basically we realized a lot of stuff that we thought was magic. We thought it was supernatural. Well, now we know it's natural. You know? So, if you remember back, I think in class number 2, we talked about this issue. It's like, when you don't understand something about the natural world, it seems magical. Because you're ignorant, you don't know how it works. You know, so there's a lot of stuff in nature that is like unbelievable until you understand how it works, right? But then once you figure out nature, you don't need the magical explanation anymore, right? And so the conflict thesis basically says that as science grows, as our knowledge grows, religion is going to shrink. In other words, people use religion to explain stuff they don't understand. You know, for example, in ancient times, if the tsunami happened, people, of course, would blame it on the gods. The gods are angry. But now we can study the bottom of the ocean. We know there was an earthquake. We know that the bottom of the ocean shifted, it cracked, and it basically caused a wave. Right? It's like we have a natural explanation for it. Now, it doesn't mean we can fix it, but we might be able to predict it next time. Like, we might be able to have tsunami warning, like if we get our act together, you know, politicians don't screw it up, like, we might be able to get some warning before the next tsunami hits. So the conflict thesis says that, like, religion is part of our past because we did not understand the natural world. It was like our best explanation. Our best explanation was, it was gods that were doing this stuff. That was just the best we could do. But as we got better, first the Greeks, then the Romans, right? You know, then eventually we get the scientific revolution, and we figure more and more stuff out, right? That the bottom line is, religion is just going to shrink and shrink and shrink and shrink anymore. So this theory is known as the God of the Gaps theory. God of the gaps. So what is a gap? Well, a gap means a gap in our knowledge. A gap in our knowledge. Something that we don't understand. So the idea is that God fills in the gaps in our knowledge. A God of the gaps. And of course, if the gap gets smaller, then God gets smaller. We just don't need God anymore. We needed God to explain all kinds of stuff. But we figured it out now. Right? We just don't need God anymore. Now, Christians or believers, they'll say, look, scientists has not figured out how life was created. Like scientists haven't figured out how to start with stuff that is not alive and make it alive. Well, scientists would respond, you're right. It's like, we have not created life yet. But that's just like talking about lightning. Like 2,500 years ago, you could say the same thing about lightning. Scientists back then, Aristotle, he could not explain lightning. He could not explain it. So people thought it was the gods. Right? That's the idea of the God of the gaps. When people don't understand something, like they don't understand, how did life start? They say, it must be God. But scientists say, we're just going to say, we don't know yet. That's the scientific attitude. When the scientists see something they don't understand, they don't say, it must be God. That is scientific materialism, metaphysical materialism. Even when scientists don't understand something, they don't jump to a supernatural explanation. They just assume everything is natural. Everything. Everything is natural. Absolutely everything is natural. It's just a question of what we know versus what we don't know. So if something really weird happens, then scientists say, wow, that was really weird. We don't understand it yet. But we will. We're working on it. We're working on it. That's the scientific attitude. We'll figure it out because it's all natural. So this way of thinking basically says there is conflict between science and religion. They don't fit together. They do not. And when science grows, religion has to shrink. And so this way of thinking says, in the future, we basically won't need religion anymore. So this kind of attitude is that in the future, religion will disappear. That we just won't need it anymore. So, what are some arguments against the conflict thesis? Well, the argument against the conflict thesis is that in reality, science and religion are actually trying to answer different types of questions. Now, it's true in the past that religious people have used supernatural explanations to explain how the earth works. That's true. Okay? But the main thing that religion is supposed to do is tell us how we should live our lives. Science really is just supposed to explain the natural world. But religion is supposed to tell us what is right and wrong. Science cannot tell us what is right and wrong. Science cannot tell us what we ought to do, what we should do. For example, scientists know a lot about human reproduction. You guys have probably seen the videos in health class. So you've seen, the sperm break through the egg and fertilize the egg. And you've seen the egg grow almost hour by hour. We can watch a human fetus grow. So literally day by day, we know exactly how a human baby grows. But that does not tell us whether it's right or wrong to end a pregnancy. So scientists can just explain what's happening. They can show us how a fetus grows. You know, they can say, well, at day 3, it's this big. On day 7, it's this big. On day 30, it's this big. So they can give us facts. But scientists can't tell us whether it's right or wrong to, like I said, end a pregnancy. So this criticism is a big issue in philosophy, and it's sometimes called, it's got a couple different names. It's called the fact-value distinction. Fact-value distinction. So the idea is that science deals with facts and religion deals with values. Fact-value distinction. And so a pretty famous scientist, a guy named Stephen Jay Gould, he developed a theory which is sometimes just called NOMA, N-O-M-A. And NOMA stands for non-overlapping magisteria. The word magisteria is a fancy word. It really means something like, magisteria means something like an entire world. A magisteria is like a world. Like the world of Harry Potter or the world of Lord of the Rings. That's what the word magisteria means. Okay? So, non-overlapping magisteria. What Stephen Jay Gould is saying is that the world of religion is a whole world, right, of beliefs and ideas and stuff. But there's another world of science. Like, it's just like you have the world of Lord of the Rings, you have the world of Star Wars, and they don't overlap with each other. Like, they don't overlap. Like, R2-D2 does not pop up in Lord of the Rings. Okay? R2-D2 doesn't just roll, you know, next to some elves. It doesn't work that way. Okay? They don't overlap. They do not overlap. It's a different world. Right? And so, Stephen Jay Gould is saying that, hey, the world of religion, it's just a different way of looking at things. It deals with different issues. Right? Science is amazing, and Stephen Jay Gould is a scientist himself, or was a scientist. But there's a world of science, and they just don't overlap, right? Science deals with facts, religion deals with values. So this is the argument against the conflict thesis. So, like deeply philosophical questions, questions like, what is the purpose of my life? Why do I exist? These kinds of questions, science cannot answer. Okay, science cannot answer what makes me happy. Like these deep philosophical questions, only religion can do that, according to this theory. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to answer that argument. So like I said, this is a very old debate in philosophy. So it goes back and forth, right? So, how are those people who believe in the conflict thesis, how are they going to respond to this fact-value distinction? Well, the first thing scientists are going to say is this. We don't need religion to tell us what is right and wrong. For example, the Ten Commandments are supposed to have come from God, right? Given to Moses, right? But we know that before that, in Mesopotamia, there was civilization there, and there was a king named Hammurabi, and we have his set of laws, the Code of Hammurabi. It's the oldest set of laws we have. This is before Judaism, before God spoke to Moses. And guess what? In the Code of Hammurabi, murder is a crime. Right? Before God said that to Moses. Right? In other words, the first argument is that basically we can use reason and common sense to figure out what is right and wrong. We don't need God to tell us what is right and wrong. It's not that hard. Right? We can look at the world, and we can study the world and figure out from that what is right and wrong. And the second part of that is that even though a lot of people say they get their morality from religion, like a lot of people say that, okay? If you actually read the religious books, most people do not follow the religious books. Okay? For example, Buddha said it was wrong to sleep on a comfortable bed. In other words, it's wrong to sleep on a mattress. Okay, you have to sleep on a flat mat. Okay? He also said dancing is a sin. Okay? So, most of you guys still dance. Okay? And you don't think of it as a sin. So you say in your head you're a Buddhist, but actually what you're doing is you're picking parts of it and you're kind of updating it for our world. Like you're using your mind to realize this dancing thing doesn't really apply anymore. That was like an old time. This is like the modern world. So you're already using your reason to decide what applies and what does not apply. And actually, every religion does this. Okay, in Judaism, if you work on the Sabbath, the penalty is death. It's very clear in the Torah. If you do homework on Saturday, the penalty is death. Okay? It's very clear. It's very clear in the Torah. Okay? There's many, many death penalties in both the Torah, in the Quran. There's the death penalty for a million different things in the Quran. Okay? It's very strict. It's very, very strict. But most people just kind of ignore that part. You know, they like, okay, hey, like, we're not going to do that anymore. You know, so in reality, people are already using their reason. They're already doing that anyway. No one is following the books exactly, right? And in fact, you know, if you look at like crazy terrorists, like if anyone is following the books exactly, it's crazy people. You know what I mean? Like if you look at what terrorists are doing, cutting people's heads off. Well, the Quran says, remove the heads of the infidels. It says that in the Quran. Remove the heads of the infidel. Infidel means unbeliever. Like people who don't believe in God or believe in Muhammad. The Quran says, take their heads off. Right? That's what it says. Right? And so you get these crazy people who are actually following the book exactly right, even though the book was written like 1,500 years ago in a time of war. Right? So most people are reasonable already. Like we're reasonable. Like most Muslims say, hey, that was 1,500 years ago. That was a time of war. So we're not going to do that anymore. Right? So this idea that morality comes from religion, scientists would say is not really true. It's not really true. A lot of people think that way, but it's not really true. Okay. The second argument that they would make is that we talked about the epistemology of revelation. Okay, we talked about that epistemology. That the truth is revealed to us in holy books. Well, scientists would argue that that is not a very reliable source of morality. Because the problem is, there are many holy books out there. So how do you know which one is right? Now, most of us think that our religion is right. But the bottom line is, none of us chose to be born, and none of us chose where we were born. So, you did not choose to be born Buddhist. Right? It's random. Like, if you were born in Saudi Arabia, you would be Muslim right now. That's just the way it is. If you're born in Europe, you'd probably be Christian. It's just the way it is. And you would think that, oh, Christianity is obviously right. Because that's where you were born. Right? But where you're born is random. Right? So how do you know which book to follow? Like really, like if you want to know the truth, well, how do you know which book is right? Right? They all say they have the answer, but the books don't fit together. Another problem why revelation is not super reliable is that for most of us, we realize that morality does change over time. or we realize that in the past people made mistakes and now we can see the mistakes better. So for example, every civilization in history practiced slavery. It's in the Torah, it's in the New Testament, it's in the Quran, it's in all these books, okay? That slavery is moral, it's acceptable. But no civilization today practices slavery. And the idea to us today is ridiculous. You know, slavery is owning another human being the way that you own your dog. Think about it. The way that you own your dog. It's your dog. Right? People everywhere in the world did that with human beings. Okay? To us, it's obviously immoral. It's obviously wrong to do that. Okay? And we use reason to kind of update our morality. And you know, I read a fascinating book about like how ideas about morality have changed over time. It's really shocking, like the stuff you find out. Like I was reading about like 200 years ago in France, just 200 years ago in France, a popular form of entertainment was cat burning. Okay, and people would buy tickets. They'd go to a theater. Okay, and on stage they would build a fire. And they would hang cats over the fire and burn them alive for entertainment. Because the cats go crazy because they're burning alive, so they scream and struggle. And people pay tickets and watch cats being burned alive 200 years ago in France. You know, they didn't have horror movies. We have horror movies. Okay? They burned cats alive for fun. For fun. In London, in 1850, they had hospitals where women could take babies they didn't want. Okay? Except the hospital was like a bin. You go there, you open up the bin, you put the baby in it, and you close the bin. Except on the other side of the bin is garbage. It was like a waste dump. Okay? And everybody knew it. So they basically, 150 years ago in London, they threw babies away. They just threw them away. Right? But if you use your mind, you can update. Like you don't have to be stuck with the old idea. You can just say, oh my God, we can't do that anymore. At some point, people realize slavery is wrong. You know, at some point, people realize animal cruelty is wrong. You know, so this is one of the problems with revelation is it can freeze knowledge. It can freeze your understanding in the past. So you can't update. You know, you can't make changes. Bottom of the page. Another argument that scientists make is that it might be true that scientists can't prove something is morally right or wrong. But scientists kind of argue that, like, once you know all the facts, it can make moral decisions like super easy or much easier. So, for example, one difficult issue is if someone is brain damaged or in a coma and they're in the hospital, is it moral to pull the plug so that they end up dying? You know, it's a difficult moral question. We'll talk about it next semester in ethics class. Okay? But scientists say, like, actually, if you know all the facts about the sick person, then actually the moral issue can become quite easy. For example, if scientists determine, hey, this person is permanently brain dead, like their brain can never recover, it's not possible, right? Well, then it becomes much easier to realize that the person is not really alive anymore. You know, their body might be alive, right? Whereas if doctors tell you, well, there's a chance they could recover, well, then of course the moral question becomes easier. So facts and values are not the same thing, of course. But the bottom line is, once you have enough facts, values can be very obvious, like value choices can be very clear. And then the last argument on top of page 4 that they make is even though people talk about the fact-value distinction, and they say religion deals with values, the bottom line is that most religions make factual claims all the time. You know, they don't just talk about morality and whether something's right or wrong. You know, even if God is not a physical thing, so everybody knows God is supposed to be non-material, right? It's still a fact whether or not there is a God. You know, so just this question: is there a God who created the universe or not? That is still like a factual question. It might not be like easy to prove or disprove, but you know, the claims that religion makes, they are factual. Either they're true or they're not true. You know, like either karma is real or it's not real. Like either rebirth is real or it's not real. Like it can't be both. Like rebirth is not like a value question. It's a fact question. Like when people die, are they permanently dead? Or are they reborn in some form? That's not a moral question. That's like a factual question about the nature of life. Like when we die, are we permanently dead or not? So scientists basically say that religions mostly don't deal with moral issues anyway. Like religions actually make factual claims about the way the world works. And so therefore, there is this conflict. Like you can't get away from it. You know, you just can't get away from it. Like either rebirth is real or it's not. You know, either Jesus rose from the dead or he did not. Like that's a factual question. Like it may be too late to know because it was supposed to be 2,000 years ago, so we may never know. But either he rose from the dead or he didn't. You know what I mean? That's like a factual question, right? You know. So scientists basically say that religion is filled with factual claims, and science is the best way to determine the truth about facts. Like it's the best way to figure out if Jesus rose from the dead or not, is to use science. You know, religion asks us to believe it on faith, right? But faith doesn't have a good track record of figuring out what's true. Like science has a very good track record of figuring out what's true. You know, like I said, I'm alive today because of science. Like that's why I'm alive. Actually, most of us are really alive today just because of good science, just because science has gotten better. You know, in the past, families had 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 kids everywhere around the world. Huge families. Because most children died. Right? Babies died. They couldn't keep babies alive. Right? Because they didn't understand science, they didn't understand antibiotics, they didn't understand germs. So people had many kids because they knew that half of them were not going to make it to be teenagers. Right? But we figured it out. It's like scientists figured it out. Like using the scientific method, using reason, like not using faith. You know, faith did not figure out the germ theory of disease. Right? Faith did not figure that out. You know, science figured it out. Right? All right, cool. We are actually going to take an early break. Actually, no, let me do a little bit more. I'm going to do one more. Let me begin the next topic, and then we'll take a break. Okay, another big part of the debate between science and religion is this big philosophical question over the existence of God. So in the philosophy of religion, the biggest question is there really a God or not? So philosophers, including Aristotle and Plato, have been debating this topic now for a long time. So what I'm going to do, the last thing we're going to do, is I'm going to kind of give you a summary of all of the arguments. So there's about 4 or 5 arguments that you guys need to understand for the final. And these are kind of classic arguments people make about God. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide the debate into kind of 2 parts. Okay? One part of the debate is kind of just a factual question about, is there a good reason to believe there's really a God or not? Okay? But then the other part of the question is more practical, and it's about, is belief in God something good or not? So a lot of people admit, a lot of religious people will admit, they'll say, look, we can't prove there's a God. But the world is a better place if many people believe. Okay, so notice there's kind of two separate issues there. Like, one is like the pure scientific question. Do we have good evidence that there's a God or not? But a different issue is belief kind of good for the world? So that second thing I call practical arguments. So we have kind of like truth claims, and then we have practical claims. So it's pretty cold in here.
Yes.
Yes. All right, let's take a break now, and I'm going to try to get them to fix the temperature. Okay? All right. So it is 10:45, 11 o'clock we'll start. 11 o'clock. Debate about them. So I just want you to be familiar with both sides. So as you guys have probably figured out, I need to know both sides of an issue. So for each argument, I'll give you kind of both sides of the debate. One of the older arguments for God's existence is called the ontological argument. You might remember the word ontology. I taught you already. The word ontology means like the status of being, like what type of things exist and what type of things exist and like what's their nature. That's ontology. So there's an old argument called the ontological argument for God's existence. I talked about it in my critical thinking class a little bit, but I know you guys don't have any critical thinking, most of you don't. So what is the ontological argument? Well, basically, it says, first, that God is perfect. That's the definition of God, right? Second, that one quality of being perfect is to exist. In other words, it's better to exist than to not exist. So if God is perfect, therefore God must exist. So this is a very old argument. It's about 1,000 years old. The ontological argument for God's existence. Now, there's a couple pretty obvious criticisms of this argument. So from a logical standpoint, it's not considered a very good argument. Okay? The first criticism of the argument is that basically it is a circular argument. So a circular argument is one where it assumes something that it's trying to prove. It assumes something that it's trying to prove. And if you look at the ontological argument, the first premise says that God is perfect. Well, the only way to know if God was perfect is if God actually existed. Like, how would we know that God is perfect if God did not exist? So when you say God is perfect, you're actually kind of assuming that God must exist. So this is kind of the first criticism of this argument, that it's not really logical. When you say God is perfect, you're assuming that God exists, and that's what you're trying to prove. And the second criticism is just this doubt that you can prove something exists just with concepts. In other words, when I just have this concept that God is perfect, so I have this belief in my head, right? How can that prove that something actually exists out there in the world? So in other words, without some evidence in the world, without some data from the world, if it's just purely in my head, is there any way to actually prove that something really is out there? So that's the second criticism. So in general, the ontological argument is considered fairly weak. So each new argument is going to be a little bit better. Okay, so as I go through arguments, the arguments for God are going to get a little bit better. Okay, so second argument for God's existence is called the cosmological argument, or the argument from first cause. Very famous argument. You will hear people say this all the time. So the argument goes something like this. Everything that exists has to have a cause. If something exists, it It has to come from somewhere. So again, it sounds like total common sense. If something exists, it had to come from somewhere. Okay? Secondly, the universe is so big. The universe itself, if we look out at all the stars, the universe is so gigantic that it must have a beginning just like anything else. Remember, everything that exists must have a beginning. The universe exists, so the universe must have a beginning. And the last part of the argument is that only something like God could create the universe. The universe can't have some kind of normal beginning. The universe is too big to have any kind of normal beginning. Therefore, God must exist. So because the universe exists, because the universe must have a beginning, then the only thing that could create the universe would be something like God. So that argument is sometimes called the argument from first cause. A very simple argument. Everything that exists has to have a beginning. The universe exists. So the universe has to have a beginning. And the only thing that could create the universe would be something like God. So let me talk about counter-arguments. The first counter-argument is that it is common sense. It's common sense. If something exists, it must have a beginning. Totally common sense. So that's true of like these glasses. It's true of this chair. It's true of you. You exist. So we can go back in time until you were just a little baby. Okay. So you must have a beginning. So it's common sense. But that doesn't mean it's necessarily true of everything. In other words, there's really no proof that everything has to have a beginning. The universe is not something normal. Just because something is true of these glasses or this chair or even me, just because I have to have a beginning, that's not necessarily proof that the universe has to have a beginning. So, one way to think about it is scientists, they know that there's kind of a normal world that we can see with our eyes that follows normal rules. But scientists also know that if you look at very, very tiny particles, like subatomic particles do really weird things that are different from like billiard balls. Like subatomic particles, they don't act like billiard balls. They have like a different set of rules. And we also know that if you look at really big things, like a black hole in space, we know that it behaves very weirdly, right? Like the normal rules don't apply to these gigantic objects in space. And so the bottom line is common sense is designed for this world that we're in. It's not designed for subatomic particles that are ridiculously small. Common sense is not applied to those things. Common sense is not applied to black holes at the center of the universe, right? And so this big issue of the beginning of the universe, well, maybe common sense does not apply. How do we know that common sense applies to something like the universe? Maybe different rules apply, right, to the center of the universe, right? So the second argument is that even if the universe must have a cause, how do we know that the cause is God? Or how do we know it's the God of the Bible? Maybe there's some other powerful being. Why does it have to be Allah that created the universe? Why does it have to be Yahweh? The Jewish people, they call God Yahweh. Why does it have to be Yahweh? It could be some other God. Or maybe it's, three gods. So even if the universe must have a God to create it, how do we know it's our God? How do we know it's the God of the Bible? Right? Maybe it's some other powerful being. It's not necessarily the God that we think it is. Right? And then, this is an example of how sometimes these arguments for God's existence are not logical. Remember that this argument says, everything that exists must have a beginning. The universe exists, so it must have a beginning. Well, then the question would be, what is God's beginning? If you say God exists, and you say that everything that exists must have a beginning, then we can just apply the same logic to God himself. Like, who created God? You know? If you say, well, God doesn't have a beginning. Okay, well then maybe the universe doesn't have a beginning. You know, if God is allowed to have no beginning, if God is some kind of exception to the rule, oh, maybe the universe is some kind of exception. Like maybe the universe has always existed. Okay, so that is called the cosmological argument. So, like I said, it's a little bit better than the ontological argument, but it's got some problems with it. So, an argument that's a little bit better, I think, than the cosmological argument is called the probabilistic argument for God's existence. The probabilistic argument. It's also sometimes called the argument from intelligent design. So let me explain it. So this argument says that the existence of life is very improbable. We know that the conditions that allow life to exist are very rare. So obviously, we've never found life on another planet other than Earth. And we know that the conditions on Earth where humans can survive are very narrow. In other words, for example, global warming that people are worried about. The worry is that the average temperature might go up 1 degree Celsius. The average temperature might go up 1 degree Celsius. If the average temperature goes up 1 degree Celsius, it's going to cause a massive worldwide disaster. Like, the ice caps are going to melt, cities like Bangkok are going to be flooded, like, entire countries like Bangladesh will be underwater. Like, if the temperature on Earth just changes by 1 degree Celsius, just 1 degree, if it bumps up like that, disaster is going to happen, right? And the idea is that, like, the conditions for life are very, like, fragile. It's like things have to be exactly right for life to happen, okay? And a very famous guy named Anthony Flew, a philosopher named Anthony Flew, he made this argument, he said, it seems like the universe was waiting for us. In other words, like, it seems like the odds that we just happen naturally, it seems like 1 billion to 1, like 1 trillion to 1, that things work out just exactly right for humans to exist. What are the odds that we would have a planet exactly right for us? It's 1 billion to 1, 1 trillion to 1, something like that. So this argument says the natural explanation is just not the best one. A natural explanation is 1 trillion to 1. And a smarter explanation is that God designed the universe. Like, the reason things worked out the way they did is because God planned it. God set it up. God designed it. Now, that doesn't mean there's no randomness in life. That doesn't mean God designs everything or makes every decision. You know, remember, we have deists. Remember, deists think God created the universe, but then just was watching, right? But this argument says the odds that everything happened naturally, the odds that we're here by chance, are just too crazy, right? And there's a famous argument where Anthony Flew says, you know, imagine if wind was blowing through a junkyard, piles of garbage, and the wind blew through the junkyard, and the wind spun all the garbage around, and it accidentally made a 747 airplane. Like, that would never happen. It's 1 billion to 1. It's 1 trillion to 1. So if you see an airplane, you're going to realize, okay, someone had to build that. The wind did not blow the pieces together naturally. Someone had to make it, right? You see a 747 airplane. Another simple example, even simpler than that. If you're walking through the jungle and you see trees and flowers and plants, you might think like, oh wow, this is all natural. But if you picked up a watch on the ground and you saw all the little pieces working together, you would realize, hey, this watch is not natural. Like, someone had to make this watch. Like, it can't just come naturally. Someone had to put it together. Right? A watch needs a watchmaker. Right? And the argument is that, like, human life is just too complex to happen naturally. Just like a watch needs a watchmaker. It's just too complex. And human beings need a maker. Just like a watch needs a watchmaker. Just like a plane in a junkyard. There's no way it got there through natural causes. Someone had to put it together. Someone had to assemble it. That's it. That's the probabilistic argument. Okay? So, what are arguments against the probabilistic argument? Well, the first argument is really saying that from a scientific standpoint, we don't really know the odds of life happening. We just don't have enough information. We've only been to 2 planets, this one and Mars, right? I mean, and we haven't been to Mars, we just put the rover on Mars. Okay, so we've been to 2 planets, right? And we know that there's millions of planets out there. Millions, for real, they're out there, right? And so we don't know how much life is on those other planets. We don't know. Maybe life is common. Maybe we're going to find out that there's life on most planets. We just don't know. We've only been to 2 out of millions. We don't have the data to know if life is common or uncommon. Also, here's something fascinating that biologists have found out. It's true that, like human beings, we need certain conditions to survive. But life on Earth survives in almost all conditions. It's unbelievable where they have found living bacteria. For example, at the bottom of the ocean, there are these vents, cracks in the earth. And basically, inside the earth is like a volcano. And so there are these vents at the bottom of the ocean where basically super hot boiling water is coming out of a crack in the earth. So it's the bottom of the ocean, and basically it's boiling water at all times. Okay? Well, scientists finally got down there with like a robot, and they grabbed some of this boiling water. Like, it's like at ridiculously high temperature. They grab some of this boiling water, they bring it up, they put it under a microscope. There's bacteria in there. Special bacteria. It cannot survive. It only lives at super high temperature. When you put it at normal temperature, it dies. There's living things in this boiling water. It's alive in boiling water. And the same thing in the polar ice caps. They dig down in the polar ice caps, and there's like bacteria living at super cold temperatures. Now, it's not human beings that are living, right? But something is living in these extreme conditions. Which means, like, on these other planets, they look, like when we look at Venus or Mercury or Jupiter, we think, oh, that's too extreme, like you can't have life there. But we don't know. We haven't been there yet, right? There could be another kind of life there. Not, obviously not human life, but there could be bacteria, or who knows? There could be, we just don't know yet. We haven't got there yet. So scientists like to say, you know, remember, scientists are not afraid to say, we don't know. That is good critical thinking. It is good critical thinking to say, we don't know yet. That is not dumb. That is smart. Okay? Smart people say, we don't have the data yet. That is a smart thing to say. Okay? So that's kind of the first argument. We don't know. We don't have the data yet. Right? The second argument is that what looks improbable, or what looks designed, could still be natural. For example, famously, you know, if you look at a snowflake in a microscope, it's a very fantastic pattern. It looks like it was designed by an architect, but it's just a natural crystal structure. Like it looks. Yes? Yeah, it's too cold. I think we'll get better now. No, too cold.
Yeah.
Okay. So, a lot of times things seem designed. But just because something seems designed doesn't mean it is designed. So, scientists have an explanation how nature got here. So, scientists have an explanation how human beings got here. So, we know from a single-cell organism, we know it's split into a multi-cell organism. And we know that that split, and we know that that split. So we know how species were created. We have an explanation. The problem is that the explanation takes millions of years to take place. So the argument is that evolution, over millions of years, it looks unbelievable. So when you look at how advanced human beings are, when you look at our intelligence or how complex our body is, it looks unbelievable. It looks like someone must have designed it. Like when, like Da Vinci, Da Vinci is a great scientist and a great artist. Da Vinci cut open a human eyeball. He cut open a human eyeball and drew pictures of the human eyeball. And the human eyeball is very complex. And for him, he was doing science. But when religious people saw it, they said, look at how complex how the eye is. That's like a watch. It's like a complex watch. And they're like, that can't be natural. Like the eyeball is like a complicated machine. It's very complex, the way the human eye works. So for religious people, they said, that's proof of God. Because it's like a machine in there. But Darwin showed that over a long period of time, natural things become very complex. Anything that gives you a survival advantage, like your eyes, will get complex over time. Eyesight improves because it helps you survive. Other parts of the body stay simple because they don't help you survive. Right? So we have a natural explanation for how complicated the eye is. It just takes millions of years to develop. So to us, it looks impossible for it to be natural. But if you think about a very long period of time, slow development, and biologists, they can just show us how the eye developed. They show us these basic fish. They barely have eyes at all. It's like they can just tell dark and light, that's it. Very basic fish, very simple eyes. Then you get like an advanced fish, it's got a little bit better eyesight. Then more advanced, better eyesight. And then another animal crawled out of the sea, better eyesight. And so we can see animal by animal how eyesight got better. It takes a long time, millions of years. But we have a natural explanation. So here's a metaphor that I like. Mount Improbable. Okay, it's just a metaphor. It's not real. There is no real Mount Improbable. You can't go there. Okay. If you type it into Google Maps, it's not going to pop up. Okay, it won't pop up in Google Maps. Okay. So it's just a metaphor. But think of it this way. If you're at the top of a mountain here, if you wake up, like you're born, you wake up and you're at the top of a mountain and you're looking down like a cliff. And you're wondering how you got there. Okay? Well, if you're looking this way, you're going to think, there's no way I climbed up here. Because you're on top of this mountain, you're looking down, you're like... And so you're going to look up and say, well, God must have picked me up and set me up here. So when human beings were waking up 3,000 years ago, like when the Jews came up with the idea of one God, right? That's like humanity waking up. And they're looking at human beings, they're like looking at us, and we're on top of the world, right? And they're like, well, how could we get here without God's help? It's the only way we could get to the top of the mountain. Of everything that exists in the world, we're on top. How could we get here if God didn't pick us up and put us here? So we get the story of the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve. We get the story. God put us on top of the mountain. God created us. Right? God created us. He put us on top of the mountain. He picked us up. He picked us up and he put us on top. But if you turn around and you face this direction, so you're looking at the cliff, you're like, how did I get here? Right? Well, if you turn around and you see a long slope that just goes back and back and back, a long slope, you realize, oh, maybe I just was back here, maybe I just walked up the slope. It would take a long time to walk up this slope, but there is another explanation how you can get to the top. Like evolution is just like the long slope. Long and slow, thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of years. And once you see the slope, it's not magic anymore how we got to the top. But if you don't see the slope, it's true. If you don't see the slope, if you don't see this, and you're just looking over here, God is a logical explanation. You know, if you don't have another explanation. But now, with science, we have another explanation. It's like, it was a long, slow incline that got us to the top. And then the last point at the bottom, that should be number 3, not number 4. The last point at the bottom. Remember, if the odds of life are very improbable, well then the odds of God also have to be improbable. Like, what are the odds that God would exist? You know, anything that you say about the universe, you can also apply to God. God is the real 747. Like, when people use God as an explanation for everything, they don't realize that God himself is a long shot. Like, what are the odds that there's God that would cause us to exist? Like, why is that explanation better than a natural one? Even if a natural one, there's high odds, well, why isn't God even higher odds? Okay, so you can apply the same logic to God as you would apply to the universe. Okay, last argument, top of page 6, for God's existence. Basically is this argument that the fact that morality exists in the world is proof that there must be a God. So a lot of people, religious people, will say stuff like, look, without God there'd be no morality. How do we know right from wrong? The fact that we, human beings, have a moral sense, that we know what's right or wrong, that proves that there must be a God. So this is sometimes called the argument from universality of belief in God. You know, a lot of people believe in God. Like, a lot of Buddhists believe in God, even though Buddhism doesn't require you to do it. If so many people believe in God, if so many people have morality, then it makes sense to believe that it came from somewhere. Why do so many people believe in God if there is no God? Why do so many people know what's right and wrong if there is no God? So this is kind of like a monotheistic argument. Like, you know, remember, monotheism says that we're all children of God. And so if we all think murder is wrong, like every culture says murder is wrong, right? So that seems to point to there being one God. You know, so morality is somewhat universal. Everybody thinks murder is wrong, right? So that seems to support the idea that there's one God, because we all have the same morality. All right, that's the last argument. So what are some arguments against that argument? Well, the first argument is this. It's true that some moral principles are universal. It's true. Like, lying is wrong. Every culture teaches that lying is wrong. Every culture does teach that murder is wrong. But the simple truth is that different cultures do not agree on the details. And they disagree on many aspects of morality. Morality is not really universal. Remember, the Galatians, they used to eat their father's dead body. That was their idea of what a good person did. They ate their father's dead body. Right? When the Greeks burned dead bodies. So how could you say morality is universal? Even if you say, well, everybody knows murder is wrong. That might be true, but they disagree on who you are allowed to murder. Like, who are you allowed to kill in self-defense? Right? So some tribes would say, of course you can kill someone from another tribe. You're just not allowed to kill someone from your own tribe. Right? Anthropologists who study different cultures, they have like fascinating stories of all these different cultures they encounter. And they really have totally different ideas about what is right and wrong. Morality is definitely not universal. The second argument is that I already talked about this idea of morality changing over time. If morality comes from God, then why does right and wrong change over time? If morality comes from God, how come the Ten Commandments do not say slavery is wrong? There's two things in the Bible that are not condemned as wrong: slavery and rape. Under Jewish law, if you rape a married woman, it's a crime and you will be put to death. If you rape a married woman, it's a crime and you'll be put to death. If you rape a woman who is not married, you must marry her. That's it. In other words, if you rape a woman who's not married, well, you break it, you buy it. Literally. Seriously. It's horrible. I mean, it's like women were like property. Like, if you rape a woman, well, now she's not a virgin anymore. So she's yours. She's yours now. So, like, imagine if you're a girl who gets raped. You become the wife of the guy who rapes you. That's in the Torah. That is in the Jewish Bible. Okay? And that supposedly came from God. That supposedly came from God. If you're a virgin and you're raped, you become the wife of the guy who raped you. By today's standards, it's craziness. Like, no one lives like that anymore. Nobody. Right? But that's true of every holy book. Every holy book. Like, they have ideas from the past. And common sense says that, like, standards will go up over time. Standards improve. Like, society gets better. It's like we learn stuff. We learn stuff. It's like we used to torture animals for fun. We used to throw babies away. Just throw them away like garbage. We used to throw them away like garbage. It was totally normal. We used to eat other human beings. Like, cannibalism was common, like in ancient times. Eat other human beings. It's common. Right? So, the fact that morality changes over time kind of goes against this idea that morality comes from God. It's like, why would God give us the wrong answer? Why would God say slavery is okay, and then later, like, change his mind or something? It doesn't make sense, right? It doesn't make sense. And then we'll talk more about this next semester. But a lot of people think that, if there was no God, then there'd be no morality. But like I already told you, for early human beings, they had morality, but they did not believe it came from the gods. Remember, early gods were not good. The Greek gods were not good. They were not good. They were partiers. Like, they drank, they had sex, they cheated, they murdered. They were not good. But the Greeks still had a sense of morality, right? And no matter where you go in the world, morality exists even if people don't believe in God. Like, morality still exists. Morality can come from common sense. Morality can come even from instinct. Morality can evolve over time. Morality can evolve over time. I don't have time to show you right now, but one of my favorites, maybe I'll post one of my favorite YouTube videos, is this video where scientists are trying to figure out if animals understand morality. Normally we think of animals as like, they're animals, like they'll do anything, right? And so there's a famous video of these two monkeys in cages. And they're just trying to see if monkeys understand the concept of fairness. You know, because like fairness is kind of like an advanced concept. So what they do is like they feed each monkey some food that the monkeys will eat, but it's not their favorite food. But they'll still eat it. You know, so they give both monkeys like the okay food, and they both eat it. But then what they do is they take some food that the monkey really likes, and they just give it to one of the monkeys, so the other monkey can see. Okay? So the other monkey's sitting there, and he sees the other monkey get like the good treat. Then they give the normal food to the other monkey. Okay? So, I mean, he's an animal, he's hungry, you think he's going to eat anything. But after he sees the other monkey get the good food, he takes this and he looks at it and he goes, he just throws it down. Like, I'm not eating that. I'm not eating that after you gave him the good stuff. Like, I want the good stuff. Like, this is a monkey. A monkey. Like, even a monkey understands fairness. Right? So, in other words, our moral instinct can evolve just like our other instincts. You know, we have natural instincts. Morality is partly natural. It can evolve. Right? And we'll talk more about that next semester. Okay, the last set of arguments are not about whether there really is a God. That's not the issue. The issue is whether you should believe anyway. Like whether it's practical, whether it makes sense to believe. You know, because the bottom line is, we're never going to be able to prove or disprove God. So some people say, we shouldn't argue about that. We shouldn't argue about whether there is a God, because we can't prove it either way. So instead we should talk about whether it makes sense to believe. So the first argument is very famous, you've got to know it. It's called Pascal's wager. Pascal was a mathematician and scientist and religious thinker. And Pascal basically said, you should believe in God. And he looked at it kind of like a bet. What should you bet on? That's why we call it a wager. Should you bet that there is a God, or should you bet that there is no God? And Pascal's argument is pretty simple. He basically says this. If you believe in God, and there really is a God, you will get a big reward in heaven. If you believe in God, but there actually is no God, then nothing's going to happen anyway. You know what I mean? Like if there's no God, then you're not going to be punished. So if you believe in God and there is one, you get a reward. If you believe in God and there isn't one, then nothing's going to happen anyway. Right? If you don't believe in God, but there is one, you will be punished. And if you don't believe in God and there is no God, then nothing will happen. So in other words, there's 4 possibilities, right? But the bottom line is, if there's no God, there's no consequences anyway. So you might as well believe in God. It makes sense. You might as well bet there is a God, because if there is one, you will be rewarded. It's a smart bet. It is a smart bet. This is Pascal's wager. It's a smart bet to bet that there is a God. So what are some answers to this way of thinking? Well, the first answer is, that's not real belief. Like God, especially the Christian God, He rewards like true belief in God. He doesn't reward like you betting on His existence. Like if you're only believing in God because of Pascal's wager, you're not a real believer. Like God can see into your heart, right? He knows whether you really believe or not. So kind of superficial belief, like you're just betting on something, like you're going to move the chip over. I bet on God. That's not real belief, right? In fact, if there was a God, He probably would not reward that type of superficial kind of thinking. The second point is, for Pascal, he was a European Christian. So for him, it's like a black and white decision. Like either you believe in God or you don't. But for educated people like us, who we know, we have studied many different religions, right? The choice is not black or white. The choice is between Theravadan Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, Protestant Christianity, Catholic Christianity, Eastern Orthodox Christianity, Sunni Islam, Shia Islam, atheism, agnosticism, Thor, Zeus. It's like the bottom line is human beings have had many religions, many, hundreds or thousands of religions have existed on planet Earth. Now, we were all born into one. Like I said, when you're born into one, you obviously think that you're right. But it's random, the family you're born into. It's random. Right? So if you actually had to pick a religion, it's not black or white. It's like, what if you're what if you're a very, very good Buddhist, but the Catholics are right? The Catholics say, if you die and you don't believe in Jesus Christ, you are going to burn in hell forever. That is official Catholic doctrine. That is official Catholic doctrine. It doesn't matter if you never murdered anyone, you didn't lie, you respected your parents, it doesn't matter. Catholic doctrine says, when you die, if you don't have faith in Jesus to save you, then that's it. You're going to burn in hell forever. Okay? And a lot of religions have this kind of black and white thing. Right? And so, it's not a simple bet. It's like if you bet on one religion, there's a dozen other religions that are going to say that you are wrong. So it's not a simple wager, the way Pascal kind of sets it up. And then the third argument is that, if there is some kind of supernatural power, it seems pretty unreasonable that that power would punish you just for a lack of belief. Like I said, that is Catholic doctrine. If you don't believe in Jesus, then you're going to be punished. But like I said, what if you were like a good person? What if you worked hard, you didn't lie, you didn't steal, you respected your parents, you took care of your family, you took care of your friend, you were good to your community? Like, what if you behaved well? It seems pretty unreasonable to think that God is going to punish you for leading a good life. Now, it's true, some religions believe that, right? But in the end, the issue really should not be belief itself. Like, the issue should be, like, how you live your life. Like, should really be more important. Okay, next argument, very important philosophically. A guy named William James, one of the leading developers of psychology. So he came after Freud, psychologist, but also religious thinker. And William James had an interesting argument about belief in God. In general, we call it the pragmatic theory of truth. Pragmatic means practical. Very interesting argument. And basically, William James said this. He basically said, we cannot prove or disprove whether or not God exists. We can't prove it. We cannot not prove it. Okay? But that doesn't mean that God's not real. It might just be beyond our ability to prove. It's like, for example, I pick a star out in the universe, 1,000,000 light years away, and I want to know, what's the center of that star? Well, I might never know, but that doesn't mean it's not real. Like, I just can't prove it or disprove it. But, like, that star has to have a center. It might just be outside of our ability to know. But that doesn't mean the star's not there. So just because we can't prove or disprove it, it doesn't mean God is not there. So, should we believe or not? Well, here's what William James said. The smartest thing to do is try believing and see what happens. So that's why it's pragmatic. We can't prove if there's really a God there. And we can't prove there's not a God. So all you can really do is try believing and see what happens. The idea is that God is supposed to reward belief. at least the Christian idea is that God wants you to worship him. The Muslim idea is that God wants you to worship him. So, William James said, it's not irrational to believe. He's saying it's rational. You should try it and see if you get the reward. It's kind of like, there's a kind of simple explanation. Like, imagine if I found a weird machine with some numbers on it, and I couldn't figure out how the machine worked. And I saw numbers and stuff, and I didn't know what it was. But I thought, maybe it's some kind of clock. But I don't know if it's a clock or not. And I have no way to prove whether it's a clock. Well, William James is saying, well, just pretend it's a clock and see what happens. It's like an experiment. Just put it next to your bed and just decide, okay, that's a clock, I'm going to follow it. And see what happens. Like, maybe if you treat it like a clock, you'll realize, oh, I get it now. It is a clock. Like, these numbers, this is what it means. But if you just say, I can't prove or disprove it, so I'm going to just ignore it, well, you miss out on the possible advantage. Right? So, this is William James. Like, it's not a proof that God exists. It's not. He's just saying that it's actually smart to try belief and see if it helps you or doesn't help you. So, what is the problem with this? Well, the first problem is that whether or not belief works is obviously separate from whether or not there really is a God. So, here's my simple example. Let's say your grandmother has her own house, but she gets scared at night. So you say, okay, Grandma, I'll help you out. And you go to her house, and you put a brand new lock on her gate. A very strong lock. And you show your grandmother the lock, and you say, you got nothing to worry about. No one can get in now. And your grandmother says, thank you. And it turns out she can sleep a lot better now. Right? Well, let's say you go visit your grandmother later, and you have the key to the lock, and you realize that the lock has been broken. And you don't even need the key anymore. You can just pull the lock open. But your grandmother doesn't know that. And you're lazy, and you're like, well, I'm just not going to tell her. She'll just see the lock's there. She'll think it works. Right? The bottom line is, the lock may provide comfort to your grandmother, even if the lock doesn't really work. It can still provide comfort to her. So if people just try believing, it might actually make them feel better. Right? It might. Like, believing might make you feel better. But in the end, you're really just deceiving yourself. Like, it's just like your grandmother believing in the lock. Like, it's a bad idea to believe in a lock that doesn't really work. Because someday someone might actually try to break in. So the issue should be whether the lock is real or not. The issue should not be whether it works or not. A lot of things work that are not real. So whether something works should not really be the issue. That should not really be important. Okay, last two arguments. Some people say that if you just study the world, so if we're trying to be scientific, if you do surveys, they will show you some research that says, hey, religious people are happier than people who are not religious. Religion makes you happy. So it's a smart thing to do. You should believe. Religion is a very old way to think. But sometimes things that are old are good, and that's why they've lasted so long. We still read Shakespeare. He wrote that 500 years ago. But it's lasted very long because it's good writing. So maybe religious ideas have lasted long because there's a lot of wisdom in them. It's valuable wisdom, right? And this research shows that it makes people happier. So what are some counter-arguments to this? Well, the key is to look very closely at the research. The research is actually pretty fascinating. So psychologists obviously study happiness. So it's one of their big issues, right? how to make people happy. It's like how we study it all the time, right? So they do endless surveys and studies to try to figure out who's happy and why they're happy. And what they found out is this. If you go to a country where most people are religious, inside that country, people who are religious are happier than those who are not. Okay, so if you live in a community where most people are religious, and you're not religious, you're less likely to be happy. But what they found out is, when they went to countries like Denmark, places like that, where religion is not very popular, okay? Like a lot of Northern Europe is not very religious anymore, okay? If you go to a community where most people are not religious, then the people who are religious are less happy. Basically what they found out is that people in the minority are less happy. You understand? So in religious countries, religious people are happier than people who are not religious. But in countries that are not very religious, okay, people who are not religious are happier than those people who are religious. In other words, like, the effect is not about the religion, right? The effect is something about community. Like, if you have the support of a community, you will be happy, right? So if you're very Christian in a very Christian country, that will make you happier. You know, if you're very Christian but around you most people are not serious, you will not be so happy. So the data shows that human beings need community support. Like, when we have the support of the community, we're happier, right? But the data doesn't really show that religious people are happier. It doesn't really show that. It depends on where you are. Okay, last argument. The last argument is that if you study behavior, then you will find that religious people behave better than non-religious people. So religious people claim, if you look at crime rates, if you look at just moral behavior, religious people are more moral. But again, this is a claim based on research, so we can look at the data to try to figure it out. So first off, a couple of interesting things. The data actually does show that religious people tend to give more money to charity than people who are not religious. That is true. Some religions require people to give money to charity. So if you just look at the data, if you look at like percent of income given to the poor, it's true. Religious people do give more money to the poor. That is true. Okay. But if you look at things like crime rate and other things like that, the data does not show that, like, in religious countries there's less crime. It does not show that. Like in the US, some states are way more religious than other states. But those states do not have lower crime rates. Do not. Like, for example, overall, like a country like Japan is not very religious. I mean, they have religion, they have Shinto, they have Buddhism, but actually in surveys, if you ask Japanese people, like, how religious are you? Most Japanese people will rate it very low. Like, it's part of their culture, like for most people, but they're not like hardcore believers in general. Japan has one of the lowest crime rates in the world, right? Super low rates of crime. And just statistically, they're not very religious. And the same thing is true of Northern Europe. Like, Northern Europe is, again, very low rates of religion, like high percentage of atheists, and they have very low crime rates. You know, the bottom line is, you know, atheists are not more likely to be criminals. Like, there's no evidence that shows that, like, people who don't believe in God, they become murderers. Like, there's zero evidence for that, right? And then there's some other interesting data. Like, for example, there's actually an inverse relationship. So when one thing goes up, the other thing goes down. There's an inverse relationship between, for example, pornography usage. Okay, so in the U.S., states that are more religious, like super Christian states in the U.S., well, there's much more searches online for pornography and much more pornography purchasing. Like if you look at like the amount of porn that's bought, the more religious the state is, the higher, the more popular pornography is. And then like states that where there are not very religious, they actually have lower like use of porn. And the same thing is true worldwide. So Google releases these interesting studies that you just on Google searches. So if you think about like the Google search, it's a fascinating source of data. Because like a Google search is basically private, like no one knows, like you don't know what other people are searching for. But Google collects all the data of Google searches, right? So they do a fascinating report about around the world, what are people searching for, okay? And searches for porn are highest in Pakistan, in the whole world, okay? They're the highest search for porn in the world. And it's a very strict Muslim country, okay? And if you look at Japan, Denmark, the Netherlands, obviously people search for porn there, okay? Porn is popular, but it's just very low compared to places that are religious. Let's talk about marriage and divorce, okay? Like traditional religion says marriage is forever. Well, in the U.S., the most religious states have the highest rates of divorce. Highest rates of divorce. So like Massachusetts in the Northeast, super liberal, not religious at all. It has the lowest divorce rate in the entire country. The least religious state, lowest divorce rate. So other than charity, like I said, the data does show people who are more religious, they give more money to the poor. That is true. That's what the data shows. But other than that, just in terms of evidence, there's no evidence that people who are less religious behave worse, right? In terms of committing crimes or other things. There's just no evidence for it. All right, guys, are there any final questions? Final exam, listen up. Final exam is 80 questions, 80, all multiple choice, okay? It covers from the first day through today, but it's mostly new stuff. So probably about 2/3 of it is just new material that was not on quiz 2. So Islam and this science and religion stuff, like half to 2/3 of it is new. We haven't invested that yet, okay? But the rest of it does go all the way back to class 1, okay? So everything for the whole semester, 80 multiple choice questions. You'll have 3 hours, but you probably won't need 3 hours, but you will have 3 hours to plan. Questions? All right, guys, we're done. Good luck on the final.